In today's episode, a man heading home on his ATV after a party gets into a serious accident. Police find his ATV the next day submerged in the ocean, but no sign of the man. All hope was lost of finding him until his arm was discovered inside the stomach of a shark. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. This is the terrifying final minutes of Diego Barria. Welcome to Final Affliction. It was the 18th of February, and Diego Barria was supposed to be heading home, but it had been a long week, and he felt like making a stop at a friend's house before he headed home to his wife and their 3 little children. But the get-together turned out to last a bit longer than Diego had anticipated. But then again, he should have expected that good old Argentinian hospitality would end up in an impromptu party. Diego texted his wife, letting her know that he'd be a little later than expected, and went on to have 2 more beers with 6 other men, all of whom were either colleagues of Diego's or they'd grown up together. Diego decided to leave before it got completely dark, and he got too tipsy to drive, so he left his buddies on the porch, started up his ATV, and headed off into the sunset. Before he drove off, he put his helmet on his head, but he didn't fasten it beneath his chin as he should have. This was a bad habit that the 32-year-old had had since he'd gotten his license at 18, and no matter how much his wife chided him about fastening that helmet on properly, Diego never seemed to learn. Diego couldn't have chosen a better time to ride home. The setting sun on the sparkling waves and the warm sea breeze were incredible to behold. He turned off the paved road onto a dirt road that ran right next to it instead. The path was mostly used by motorbikes and bicycles who wanted to stay off the main road and the many cars that frequented it during the day. The shops and storefronts that lined the streets across from the ocean were all dark and quiet, having closed their doors for the weekend hours ago. Every now and then a car would drive by, but other than that, there were no other people around. Maybe if Diego had driven home just an hour or 2 earlier, things would have gone differently. But the usually crowded street held no help for him when his bike hit a rock hidden beneath the sand. He hadn't been speeding, but Diego was going just fast enough that when the ATV hit the rather large stone, it flipped to the side, sending Diego flying into the high tide that was crashing onto the rocky beach. The 4-wheeler rolled 3 times, coming to a rest back on its wheels. With no driver astride it, it rolled forward a few feet deeper into the shallows before it came to a standstill. It had rolled into a sandy area with its wheels halfway submerged under the water. Diego, on the other hand, flew well past where the bike stopped, tumbling through the air. The unfastened helmet flew right off the moment he'd hit the boulder. The driver went down hard, head first, on top of a rocky outcrop. The force was so sudden and strong that it was able to fracture his skull and render him unconscious. His motionless body rolled into the rising water, landing face down in the waves. Through the night, his wife just assumed that he'd gotten caught up in a party, so she didn't notify anyone of his disappearance until much later the next day. All the while, Diego and his ATV were slowly being dragged deeper and deeper into the water, with only the stars and the sound of crashing waves to pay witness to what was happening. It didn't take long for his body to be swallowed up by the ocean, be dragged off into the depths. But the motorcycle was much heavier, so the waves just kept pushing it further and further south along the wave line. If it were daylight, people would have seen the handlebars traveling inch by inch down the shoreline, but the night hid them from view. The next afternoon, on February 19th, 2023, when no one had heard from Diego and he wasn't with any of his friends, the search parties were finally sent out. They found the helmet at the spot where he'd crashed, but the bike wasn't found until the 20th, several miles outside of town, completely submerged in the water. Since Diego's bike showed signs of damage consistent with the crash, the conclusion was made that he'd probably had an accident close to where the helmet was found. But since there was no body to confirm what had happened, no one could say for sure what transpired on that night. Almost 2 weeks later, on March 3rd, a crew of fishermen pulled a net full of fish into their fishing vessel. Among their catch was a 5-foot school shark. School sharks are common almost everywhere on the planet. They never attack humans, preferring to prey on sea creatures that are much smaller, or simply scavenging to get by. Their fins are highly sought after and are usually sold at local markets across South America, Asia, and Africa. On the vessel, the men began gutting the biggest fish they caught, but they made a grisly discovery when they cut it open: a human arm with a rose tattoo on its wrist. Horrified and alarmed, the fishermen dropped everything that they were doing and radioed in for help. By the time they reached the harbor, the authorities were already waiting for them. The arm and the animal whose belly held the remains were taken to the coroner, as well as the 3 other school sharks that were caught by their net. After conducting an extensive examination, the coroner concluded that 2 of the smaller specimens did not have any human remains in their systems, but the 2 larger ones, a 4-foot female and a 5-foot male, the one that they gutted first, did. The male's stomach had only the left arm of an adult male, while the female had scraps of human flesh and skin inside her digestive tract. By the time that the discovery was made, she'd most likely digested most of what she'd eaten. It didn't take long to match the tattoo to Diego Barria. Of all the body parts that could have possibly wound up in that particular shark's digestive system, it just happened to be the most identifiable part of Diego, and also the most important part of him. He'd gotten it when he was just 20 years old, when he first met his wife. He'd given her a single red rose when he asked her out on a date for the first time. 1 month later, he had the flower inked into his arm, and 3 months after that, they were married. Daniela still believes that he somehow came back from the other side and led that one shark into the net so that she could find him and bury him, or at least bury what little was left of her Diego after his tragic, final affliction.